New Jersey, as it'll be known, is established as a proprietary colony by this handsome devil, James the Duke of York. James and his brother had been in exile during, if you know your English history, I'll give a very brief English history lesson, but if you know your English history in the middle of the 1600s, there's the English Civil War. The parliamentarians behead King Charles I, James's father. James and his brother Charles are forced to flee to France under the protection of the Catholic king there. Cromwell rules England for 10 years. Cromwell dies, and Parliament is kind of like, well, maybe we could invite those guys back, and so they do. James and his brother have a problem in that they have amassed huge amounts of debts because they've been used to living like a king for 15 years, but they've been in exile and haven't really had any access to any money. So they have some massive debts. They're king, but Parliament isn't exactly going to open the checkbook and say, oh yeah, we're kind of sorry about your debt. Here's a whole bunch of money to pay off, your drinking bills from when you were in Paris. So James and his brother do and take advantage of the assets that they do have, and that principal asset is land. It's land here in America. No, they didn't ask the Indians if they could sell it. They just go ahead and do so anyway. And so on June the 24th, 1664, James, the Duke of York, issues this charter which establishes the land between what we know as the Hudson River and the Delaware River, and this land is to be called Nova Caesarea, or New Jersey. So it's actually on June 24th, 1664, that the words New Jersey are used for the first time. The land is sold to two men, Sir George Carteret and John Lord Berkeley. Both men had been loyal supporters of Charles and James. Both had loaned them money, and so this is essentially a way to pay them back. And the land is to be called New Jersey in recognition of Carteret's gallant defense of Charles and his brother on the Isle of Jersey, as they kind of were fleeing England and heading to France. So what's cool, I'll go back for a second. So in 2014, there was a statewide celebration of the 350th birthday of New Jersey. I never got the language quite right because birthday didn't feel right for land that had been here for a long time, and celebration was what the marketing people wanted, but the historians were kind of more cautious about it, and I'm not convinced that we got the language right. But one of the cool things we did is we did feature an exhibit of the original charter. We had a grantor that essentially gave us a special locked UV glass, super protected case that we had, and so we were able to have a display of this in the state capitol on the 24th of June. And then it's in the state archives now, and the mayor is essentially the governor of the Isle of Jersey came over, and he was one of the guests at this ceremony in 2014. So that was kind of cool. The kings of England were using proprietary colonies at the time because it was a way to establish colonies on the cheap. Essentially what you did is you gave political control and economic power to, in this case, Carteret and Berkeley, or to whoever the proprietors were going to be, and encourage them to establish settlements, but you're not having to pay any of the administrative costs, you're not having to pay any of essentially the startup costs for establishing the colony. And when those trade goods start coming in, you can levy tariffs on them, duties on them, and things like that. And so the kings are, in fact, making money, and they're not having to invest a lot of capital up front, which they definitely don't have. Berkeley sells his share of Nova Caesarea, of New Jersey, fairly early on. Two additional proprietors who are Quakers are brought in, and so they divide the land into West Jersey, what we would consider South Jersey, and here we're very clearly in North Jersey, and East Jersey, which we consider to be North Jersey, is East and West Jersey at the time, right? So pork roll, Taylor ham, no Wawa, and we know where we are. Got that right. So under the Quaker proprietors, West Jersey issues what are known as the West Jersey Concessions of 1676, 1677. And these are noteworthy because this is a really radical Quaker statement of governance, and they establish fairly early on a very strong role for local control and local politics. So yes, this is where it comes from, all of these battles about local control and the fact that we have to have 500 some school districts and everyone wants their own 911 system and everything else. Goes all the way back to 1676 and 1677. The West Jersey concessions embody these Quaker ideals and what were for the time, and even to a certain extent today, would be fairly radical social and political doctrines. There's a strong state assembly that's established for West Jersey, and that manifests itself across the entire colony. Elections are annual. Imagine if we could have elections every year, how much fun that would be. And are done by a secret ballot, which was a new innovation at the time. We take for granted a secret ballot. At the time, that was not the norm. There's considerable protection for civil liberties. Religious freedom is assured, the right to trial by jury, the absence of debtor prisons, the lack of mandatory death sentences even in capital cases, and security from arbitrary arrest are all enshrined in the West Jersey concessions. And in fact, on legal cases involving Native Americans, juries were to be comprised of 6 English and 6 Native Americans. So there was even this effort to try and make the legal system fair. You're not going to find that anywhere else in America at the time. And so it establishes this really important precedent for radical and democratic rule that will have some upsides but also some downsides. East Jersey grows more rapidly than does West Jersey. There's Dutch settlers that are forced out of New York after a failed rebellion in the 1680s. They settle along the Raritan and the Hackensack rivers, among other places. New Englanders come down and establish Woodbridge and Piscataway before also founding Newark here in the 1660s and 1670s. The Scottish arrive at Perth Amboy, and Europeans are joined by Africans who are forcibly migrated along with their masters who come from Barbados and some of the other Caribbean islands and are settling in East Jersey as well. And this will also establish an important dichotomy in that you have a much larger African population, a much stronger slave presence in the colonial and revolutionary period in East Jersey than you have in West Jersey. So this is from a much later time, but a slave advertisement. West Jersey has 2 principal towns, Salem and then also Burlington, and primarily from England, Ireland, and Wales. So if we take a pause in 1701, New Jersey has incredible ethnic and religious diversity for the time. Over 45 different religious congregations are meeting in 1701. For the 350th in 2014, I worked with the Historical Commission and we identified 3 main themes that we wanted throughout the course that we saw as kind of the most important throughout New Jersey's history. And those were liberty, innovation, and diversity. And this is where the diversity piece comes through. Historians mostly agree for colonial America that the middle colonies of the 13 English colonies, the middle colonies were by far the most diverse, and New Jersey is the most diverse of the middle colonies, so we can therefore argue, I think successfully, that New Jersey is the most diverse of all of the English colonies around 1701. 1701 and 1702 marks a good transition point because in 1702 New Jersey becomes a royal colony, which essentially means that now the king is going to appoint the governor, is going to have more of an administrative structure, and he's going to do that because he recognizes that there's more money to be made here in New Jersey. They're turning other colonies into royal colonies as well. So essentially, the proprietors negotiate an end to their political authority. They maintain control over their land claims. That'll get messy later, and we'll talk about that. And this handsome devil is the first royal governor of New Jersey, Lord Cornbury. Lord Cornbury got the job because he was cousin to Queen Anne. So what do we notice about Lord Cornbury here? He is presented in women's clothing. This is not a picture. This is not an Instagram filter. This is not anything like that, right? So historians for a long time looked at this and said, well, you know, New Jersey's first governor was transgendered and New Jersey politics has been a disaster ever since, and we can go back to 1701 to do that. This is more importantly recognized, though, as an early indicator of just how dirty and nasty New Jersey politics could be. Because Lord Cornbury was coming in and representing a much stronger royal authority, and consequently he had a whole lot of enemies among established landholders, among the established political elite who weren't so pleased that the king was taking such a strong interest in their affairs. And so this portrait, historians have agreed, was basically an effort to kind of challenge his rule, to dispute his authority, and to kind of bring him into ill repute. And it worked pretty successfully. Cornbury was denigrated by his opponents at the time as a despicable maggot. So if you think New Jersey political debate discourse is bad now, this is, again, is a trend for over 300 years at this point, right? Cornbury and the other colonial royal governors in New Jersey faced the same kind of challenges that colonial governors faced throughout the other colonies, which is they're appointed by the king, but they're stationed here. They have to live here. They want to be friends and get invited to the cool parties with the political elites here, which means that they have to play nice with the people who are really their political opponents. And it creates a real tension for the governors who are being told by the king or by the king's council, look, you have to execute these laws, but then are being told by the legislature, look, if you execute this law, we're not going to pay you your house rent for the next year. Or you just kind of get ghosted for some of the important parties and things like that. And so the governors are constantly trying to navigate that. Colonial elections are democratic by the standards of the time. They're not democratic by the standards of our time. To vote in the colonial period, you had to own 100 acres of land or 50 pounds property, and you had to have 10 times that amount in order to hold office. So this is a fairly restricted democracy at the time. You have a series of land riots that break out in the 1740s to the point that there's efforts to call in British troops to quell these riots. And this, again, is a legacy of the proprietary period in which who owns the land that you're trying to buy is completely unclear. So sometimes you just have squatters that are occupying the land without purchasing at all, but I might come and say, okay, I want to buy this land, and you say you have the title to this land, and I come and buy the land from you. But then you come to me and say, what are you doing on my land? And I say, what do you mean your land? I just bought it from him. And you say, no, I have this deed that goes back to this other proprietary period. This is my land. Now you have to pay me. And so I'm like, I've already paid for this land. I'm not paying you. And you said, well, you're occupying my land. And we both call our lawyers and our friends and everything else. And all kinds of trouble breaks out. The rule of real estate works more or less here in New Jersey in this time as it does other places, which is possession is 9/10 of the law, and whoever was on the land, particularly if you had at some point made kind of a good faith effort to buy it from someone, then you would usually get title to it. But there's some land disputes that go on through the colonial period and actually through the Revolutionary period as well. But just to give you an idea, by 1745, more than 500,000 acres of land ownership was being contested through legal and semi-legal means. New Jersey benefits considerably from its place in the British Empire, particularly in the middle of the 1700s. The most famous war of this period is the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, which of course takes 9 years here in America, but it's only 7 years in Europe, and that's where it gets its name from. But if you notice here, I don't have a cursor, but if you notice, New Jersey really has no open border where the French or their native allies can come and attack easily. So most of the fighting for the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, the Great War for Empire, a lot of it is happening in Canada. I actually finally had the opportunity to go to Quebec City this past October. It's gorgeous. I highly recommend it. The food is great. With the exchange rate, everything's on sale for 25% off, so you can look at the prices at the really fancy restaurants but not balk too much because you're still getting a good deal. It's cold, but that's all right. So there's fighting up there, and then all along these backcountry areas. But New Jersey doesn't have a backcountry, so there's no real fighting on New Jersey's territory. Their settlements, wherever they are, aren't really in danger by attack from the French or their native allies in this period. New Jersey does make some contribution to the war effort. This is always tricky because the Quakers are pacifists. The spectrum of Quaker pacifism is pretty broad, so there's some Quakers that believe that any kind of support, financial support, having a food drive or anything for a military effort is inappropriate under Quaker doctrine, and others are like, I'm not going to specifically fight, but I'm willing to appropriate money, I'm willing to pay taxes that are going to go towards a military effort or whatever. But because of that, New Jersey's contribution to the British war effort in the 7 Years' War in terms of monetary contribution isn't as great as it is for some of the other colonies. There are about 3,000 New Jersey men that fight in the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War is really important because it's what sets the stage for the coming of the American Revolution. The 7 Years' War is a tremendous victory for the British. They defeat the French. They force them out of Canada. They open up the middle third, essentially, of what is now the United States to settlement without having to worry about the French. Yes, the Indians are still not being asked about this, but no one's worrying about them too much anyway. But it also caused the British to go into a tremendous amount of debt, and trying to pay off those debts by raising taxes in the colonies is not by any means the only cause of the American Revolution, but it is an important cause of the American Revolution. So if we pause here again, in 1763, New Jersey is the 5th smallest of the 13 colonies. I guess that makes it the 8th largest, however you want to crack it down. Population is 94,000 in 1763. It continues to grow rapidly. And 60% live north. 195 is where I draw my North Jersey, South Jersey line, and I know that the governor believes strongly that there's a Central Jersey, and we can entertain that debate. But essentially 60% of the population and about 80% of the African population lives north of that I-195 line. Then as now New Jersey has a population, our population density, of course, is only going to increase dramatically from this time period, but still no large city. So a population of 94,000 people, the largest city is Elizabethtown with a population of 1,200. For comparison, Philly's population at this time is probably 10 or 12,000, and New York's is probably 8,000 or so. That Quaker presence is important, particularly for the culture of South Jersey. My son goes to, I live in South Jersey. My son goes to a Quaker school down there. He's getting a good education. I like to joke that the more you pay, the less they actually go to school, which is a little bit frustrating, but he's doing great. And you know, this is a cultural presence, but also they have a pretty tremendous trade dynamic. And trade is the defining feature in many ways of New Jersey. Ben Franklin refers to New Jersey as a barrel tapped at both ends, with New York on the one side and Philadelphia on the other. It becomes hard, as it is now, for New Jersey to establish its own centers in a way, right? We don't have our own sports teams, even if...
The Devils.
We have the Devils. Okay. Well, I'm a Caps fan, so... you know, but one of the things that really frustrated us, and I remember yelling at the TV quite a bit, is when the Super Bowl was at the Meadowlands, they kept talking about the New York Super Bowl, and all of the New Jersey people wanted to complain about that. And of course, the Jets and the Giants both practice and play in New Jersey. But you know, there is a bit of a media presence. But again, we get most of our news, most of our information from either Philly or New York, our sports teams, and so much of the culture. There is great culture here in New Jersey, but frequently you've got to go across a river to get to the bigger events, which wouldn't necessarily be the case in some other places. It also establishes New Jersey then as a transportation nexus, and our location is really key. Our road infrastructure later on, this will include railroads and canals. Now our airports are really important as well for this kind of impact. The trip from New Jersey, from New York to Philly in the 1770s was 2 or 3 days, so essentially what it takes now on the turnpike. New Jersey would become a center for education, and especially higher education, in part as a result of the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is this kind of tremendous religious revival. It leads to a massive increase in religious denominations, and correspondingly a demand for trained ministers or semi-trained ministers to preach to them. This leads to, they can't recruit enough from Europe, so you have different congregations and denominations creating schools here. So the College of New Jersey is founded, which is now known as Princeton, and under the leadership of John Witherspoon develops a curriculum rooted in the Scottish Enlightenment and pretty strong ideas at the time. Any graduates of Queen College in the audience? Queen's College is also Rutgers. Your master's, that'll count. Okay, that counts. So this is it's originally founded as a Dutch Reformed church. So then, just as we talked with some important antecedents from 17th century New Jersey to the present, there's some important antecedents of 18th century New Jersey to the present. Its position, our geography hasn't changed, and so that transportation as a key transportation nexus is very much in play there. Our education, yes, our K-12 education has slightly, one of my big frustrations is we spend so much money on our K-12 education and then we don't on our higher ed. And so many New Jersey high school graduates are really highly educated and excellent, and then they go to other states to go to college and they never come back. It doesn't make any sense to me, but I'm not in charge of that. And yes, I'm biased because I work at a New Jersey state school, but I make pretty good money, so that's all right. So, July 4th, 1776, everyone's first instinct is going to be to think about the Declaration of Independence. But up here in Jersey City, no one knew that the Declaration of Independence had been passed yet because they couldn't read it on Twitter or get a text about it. And in fact, on July 4th, 1776, what George Washington was concerned about was some things happening right here in New Jersey. So on July 4th, 1776, Washington didn't know that the Declaration had been passed either. He wrote to General Hugh Mercer, and he wrote, quote, "Upon full consideration of all circumstances, I have concluded to send the militia home, except 500 to guard Bergen Neck," essentially here, "which I deem an important post and capable of being used very much to our prejudice. I'm also of an opinion that a body about Woodbridge and Amboy would be very useful. I propose to retain the Morris County Militia for that purpose and leave it to General Livingston to order the security of the other places." The militia are getting cranky at this point, and he recognizes it having militias, serving in the militia and recruiting troops for the militia is a problem for New Jersey throughout the war. A few days later, I think it's July 8th, Mercer replies. He says, quote, "On examining Bergen Neck, I found some stock of black cattle and horses still remain there, and that some families on the point held an intercourse with the enemy," so are trading with the enemy. "Colonel Ford assured me that he would have all of those removed today. His force amounts to no more than 350, and those being dissatisfied are remaining on duty while the remaining militia are dismissed." Basically, he doesn't have enough troops. He was charged with having 500 troops here at Bergen Neck. He can only have 350. "We are informed that a body of militia being on the march from Pennsylvania, on their arrival, I shall order part of them to Bergen Neck." This area was also, so even before the Declaration of Independence was signed, the war, of course, had been going on for over a year at this point, but even before the Declaration had been signed, fortifications were being built at Paulus Hook and at other key sites to try and defend the approaches to Manhattan. And it's actually only a couple of days after this that on July 12, 1776, 2 British warships sailed up the Hudson River, unleash a fierce barrage on the defenses at Paulus Hook, so that some men fled from their post. Others got so anxious, again, these are relatively untrained and unpracticed militia troops, fail to prepare their cannon properly, so one cannon blows up inside the fort, causing significant casualties. Washington didn't really have a great year for most of 1776, the truth be told. Washington also situated his flying camp, as it was known, near Jersey City. This essentially was to be his reserves. Washington knew the British were coming. He knew they were coming to the New York City area. He just wasn't completely sure where exactly they were going, how many were coming, and because he knew that the British, once the British were established here, they were going to dominate the waterways. The British Navy was far superior to anything the Americans could hope to have. He was hoping to have men stationed in different areas as kind of a strategic reserve that he could then bring to bear wherever he thought that was necessary. So he establishes a flying camp here at Jersey City so that it could be prepared to go north if there was a danger of a crossing further north up the Hudson, for example, or south towards Elizabethtown if the crossing was going to come from Staten Island or in that vicinity. But again, a lot of these militiamen are basically growing bored at being stuck here and not actually having a whole lot to do. It's getting to be harvest time, and so some of them ask to be discharged and get discharged, and others sometimes just return home. During the British assault on Long Island, Mercer's troops are moved to reinforce Manhattan, so that the flying camp troops are moved across the river to Manhattan, and other New Jersey militia are being brought into this area to try and defend the Hudson approaches. But at this time, the British aren't trying to force their way up the Hudson. Retreating across the Jerseys, essentially the short version is the New York campaign doesn't go very well for Washington at all. It's perhaps his worst performance as a general. He's taken somewhat by surprise at Long Island. His men aren't ready, his officers aren't ready, and he's pretty quickly defeated on Long Island. They retreat to Manhattan. Who's seen Hamilton? No? Okay. Who's listened to Hamilton? No. You should go listen to Hamilton and not listen to me. It's way better. I didn't even drink any water. So, but essentially, the New York campaign goes really badly, and by October of 1776, Washington's forces are retreating south and west across New Jersey. Paulus Hook is abandoned. It's occupied by British troops. Becomes the first territory in New Jersey occupied by the British, and it remains under British control until the end of the war, with one notable exception that we'll talk about in a little bit. In January of 1777, William Howe, who was the British commanding general, had a distribution of 360 infantry stationed at Paulus Hook. Later in that winter, as part of what was known as the Forage Wars, there was a British warship that was caught in the ice just north of here, and some American forces tried to attack it without too much success. So in the fall of 1776, you have Washington and his army retreating south and west across New Jersey, ultimately pushing all the way across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. The British General Cornwallis makes a fateful decision not to pursue Washington across the Delaware, establishing winter quarters at posts essentially from Bordentown and Trenton through New Brunswick and all the way up here to Jersey City. But Cornwallis argues, basically, and believes that the American army has been soundly defeated. Their morale is terrible. They don't have a lot of supplies. They don't have a lot of support. He doesn't have to force a crossing across the Delaware and go and pursue this army. He thinks that that army will probably just disintegrate of its own. And whatever remnants are left there in Pennsylvania in 1777, he can go and mop up, and this thing will be over. So there's an argument. My former department chair, Mark Lender, at Kane basically argued that it's Cornwallis's decision on December 11th, 1776, to go into winter quarters instead of finishing the job against Washington is actually this decisive moment. Because we know that Washington will cross the Delaware on Christmas evening, yes, and show up on the morning of the 26th unexpectedly and win this kind of audacious victory at Trenton. He'll retreat across the Delaware only to come back and win a second battle at Trenton, win another victory at Princeton, where Alexander Hamilton, who was mad about not being let into Princeton, makes sure to put a cannonball through Nassau Hall, and then they retreat up to Morristown, gathering supply, essentially up 287, if you've ever been to that part of New Jersey. It feels far from here for some reason. But essentially following 287 to go into winter quarters at Morristown. And so Washington's army lives to fight another day. Washington reestablishes his credentials as both a tactical and a strategic general, and he has some success that enables him to recruit troops. New Jersey as a whole has this designation of the crossroads of the American Revolution. That makes sense if you consider that the British are headquartered in New York and the Patriot capital is down in Philadelphia. New York is stuck between the two. I grew up in Virginia, Northern Virginia. At this point, I think I'm next in line to be governor of Virginia. But Virginia has that same situation in the Civil War, in which you have the Confederate capital at Richmond and the Union capital in Washington, D.C., and so a whole ton of battles between those two areas. New Jersey occupies that same space for the American Revolution. So Washington's success at Trenton does not win the war. There's a whole bunch of fighting to be done, but the war could have been lost at that moment or shortly thereafter if he had failed. So when we were coming up, we did a video series for the 350th called It Happened Here in New Jersey, and we identified 52 of the most important people and places and events in New Jersey history. We got 31 of those produced before we ran out of money. But in our calculation, they're really good videos. They're 90-second videos. You can Google it on It Happened Here in New Jersey. If there's any teachers in the audience, each of them has a learning activity associated with it for different grade levels. It's a really great resource. They continue to get used. It's one of the things I'm proudest of from the legacies of this 350th project that we did. But the 10 crucial days, Washington at Trenton and then second Trenton and Princeton, we judged to be the most important moment in New Jersey history. And yes, I'm biased because I'm a historian of the American Revolution, but I certainly stand by that categorization. It's important for New Jersey history and for American history. But as a whole, New Jersey has more battles fought on its territory than any other state in that's in the conflict. 1777 again goes more poorly than good for Washington, who's defeated at a series of battles around Philadelphia, enabling the British to capture Philadelphia in October of 1777. They spend the winter there, then they realize that they're stuck in Philadelphia and they could be in New York, and so they leave and retreat basically. So when they invaded Philadelphia, they attacked by sea. They went down out of New York all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay, up the Chesapeake Bay, and then marched overland from there. On the way back, they decide they're going to walk, in part because they're trying to draw Washington into a battle. And they're basically making their way from Philadelphia to Sandy Hook, and from there they'll go by boat back to New York. So this leads to the Battle of Monmouth, which is the largest single battle in New Jersey. I guess it's probably the largest single battle on New Jersey territory. I haven't really thought about it that way, but probably. So Monmouth is really important because it's another demonstration of the Americans' ability under Washington's leadership, particularly to fight toe-to-toe with British regulars. And they really hadn't established that to this point. The winter of 1777, 1778 is the Valley Forge winter. The Army spends that winter drilling and becoming a more disciplined, prototypical European-style army, which is really what Washington wanted. He believed that he needed this kind of classical, what happened? Do I cut out of this and retry it? There we go. I just lack patience.
What was the date of the Battle of Monmouth?
It's June 28, 1778. Sorry about this. So the Battle of Monmouth. The Battle of Monmouth is perhaps most famous for Molly Pitcher, a woman who assumed her husband's duties after he was wounded in battle. In his journal entry about the battle, Joseph Plum Martin, who was a Continental Army veteran, he wrote, quote, "A woman whose husband belonged to the artillery and who was then attached to a piece in the engagement attended with her husband at the piece for the whole time." Molly Pitcher is said to have helped load shells. This isn't the quote. And for her valor, she reportedly earned the personal thanks of George Washington. As is the case with many war stories, Martin's account must be taken with a grain of salt. Historians have debated who the woman was. They can't narrow it down to a single woman. Some believe her to be Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay. Others claim she was Margaret Corbin, who did have a husband in that regiment. Most likely, Molly Pitcher is kind of a composite story based upon these and other women who are participating in the cause of independence. And the frustrating thing here, of course, is that we want this woman superhero to be our embodiment of how women are contributing to the cause of the American Revolution. When women are making innumerable contributions to that cause, you don't have to stand at a cannon in order to be playing an important role in American independence. So this story kind of highlights some larger issues with the way that this history has long been treated. Another cool thing, and this is something that hopefully you'll be hearing more about as we get closer to the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, is in New Jersey, you have the so-called petticoat electors, and that's because women could vote from 1776 to 1807 in New Jersey, some women. When independence was declared, of course, each state had to issue its own constitution because it no longer had a form of government that it had under the British rule. And so New Jersey's constitution in 1776, as was the case for a lot of these state constitutions, was an incredibly kind of democratic one. And so the right to vote was given to any inhabitant who was Protestant and owned 50 pounds of land or real property. And that lack of specificity meant that women who met that qualification, or even blacks who met that qualification, could vote. And we know that there's a number of women who voted, particularly in the elections in 1790s, but elsewhere as well, until the Constitution was revised in 1807. In one election, the 1797 election in Essex County, at least 75 women voted. And in fact, you see efforts in the newspapers, and there's even rallies at some point for both parties, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, to try and win the support of these women voters. Again, a woman would have to be a widow or single in some way, but essentially if she was a widow and didn't have any heirs and had inherited enough property from her husband, she would be empowered to vote. For a long time, historians argued that the New Jersey Assembly in writing the Constitution was just kind of lazy and sloppy. They didn't really mean for women to be able to vote. They just didn't write it right. But more recently, there seems to have been a recognition, again, this is a fairly democratic moment, that if voting qualifications are going to be based on class, that allowing rich, educated women to vote was a less radical idea than allowing poor, uneducated men to vote. In 1807, male leaders in both parties, one thing they could agree on was that they needed a new election law, and this election law disenfranchised women and blacks and aliens in order to try and maintain elite male control of political power. And so women would have to wait for more than a century until the campaign led by another New Jersey citizen from my part of New Jersey, Alice Paul, who would lead the campaign for women's suffrage, eventually successful in 1920. And I know the Council for the Humanities and the Historical Commission is going to be running a whole bunch of events starting later this year, even to celebrate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. So I mentioned that there was a brief moment when the fort at Paulus Hook was not held by the British, and that would occur on August 18th, 1779. When Major Henry Light Horse Harry Lee, who was 23 years of age, left Paramus, wouldn't we all, with 300 war-weary Continental soldiers who made their way through the marshes and launched a surprise pre-dawn attack on the British fort here at Paulus Hook. Lee's two columns arrived at 3:30 a.m. They were met by the British 64th Regiment, and Lee's forces succeeded in capturing the fort. They took over 150 prisoners before retreating, which was their orders. Washington basically had authorized this as a hit and run raid. There was no real way to maintain occupation of the fort at this time. But they managed to spike and otherwise disable the British cannons in the fort. They take these 159 prisoners. Lee, the fighting lasts only 30 minutes, and then Lee begins his retreat. As it's described, past Pryor's Mill, down Middle Road, which is now Tinnell Avenue, which it took to get here, so it can't be that far, and going to the Hackensack River. There's a new biography of Light Horse Harry Lee. I just read a review of it, and it's pretty positively reviewed. Light Horse Harry is also famous because he's Robert E. Lee's father. But this is considered to be among the most daring exploits of the entire Revolutionary War, and Lee is awarded a medal for exceptional valor for his daring maneuver. And apparently there's a monument at the southeast corner of Washington and Grand Streets. I think that's that previous thing. But you all live here and I don't, so you could tell.
And there's a restaurant called.
Yes, yeah. So there's two restored brownstones next to it. That's the Light Horse Tavern in his honor as well. The winter of 1779-1780 was probably the harshest winter that the Continental troops had. The conditions are much worse. Valley Forge is much more famous. Morristown should be. because it's much more important and the conditions were actually much harsher in Morristown, particularly the second Morristown winter, 1779, 1780. It was among the harshest on record with 28 separate snowstorms, which I could use a snow day, so that doesn't sound terrible to me, but that's a lot of snow if you're living in a hut that doesn't exactly have particularly good walls. So Washington wrote in March of 1780, quote, "The oldest people now living in this country do not remember so hard a winter as the one we are now emerging from. In a word, the severity of the frost exceeded anything of the kind that had ever been experienced in this climate before." And Washington, of course, was in Ford Mansion, safely housed, plenty of food, plenty of firewood, and everything else. The soldiers living in huts that were constructed for that purpose for the winter faced much more severe conditions. And one soldier wrote in his diary, quote, "The consequences of the lack of supplies, food, and firewood," he was writing, "the consequences that the soldiers are so enfeebled from hunger and cold as to be almost unable to perform their military duty or labor in constructing their huts." These troops would fight the last major battle in New Jersey, which was the Battle of Connecticut Farms and the Battle of Springfield, on Morris Avenue near where Kean University is, and those are the last major engagements of the war in New Jersey as the main theater would move to the south.
And that was when, early 80?
That's June of 80, yeah. The Revolution also provided opportunities for the enslaved population of New Jersey, and perhaps the most famous enslaved man who would turn loyalist was Titus, who would be known as Colonel Ty. This actually is the actual runaway slave advertisement that his master had issued for him in November of 1775, £3 reward for a Negro man named Titus. Colonel Ty made a name for himself at the Battle of Monmouth, where he captured a New Jersey militia captain. And from then, he would continue leading a number of successful raiding parties, mostly into Monmouth County from Staten Island, stealing cattle, capturing Patriot leaders, and killing several militia officers. And one of the ways in which we know of how prominent Colonel Ty was that British regular troops would operate with his militia, which typically wasn't the case. The British regular forces didn't want anything to do in operating in conjunction with the militia because they didn't trust them. But they would with Ty, and Colonel Ty was actually killed on a joint mission with British regulars in, I think it's in 1780. And so the upheaval of the war allowed many enslaved persons to find freedom behind British lines. But the war's legacy for emancipation and abolition in New Jersey is pretty complicated, because during the war effort you have a real fear of, there's efforts on both sides who are willing to free enslaved persons if they're willing to serve in the military. There's also a fear, particularly on the Patriot side, of giving guns to former slaves, no matter which side they profess their loyalty to. After the war, it becomes easy to say, well, we need our slaves in order to restore our economic fortunes. So New Jersey is regrettably the last northern state to pass a law for gradual emancipation. It's not until 1804 that New Jersey passes a law for gradual emancipation. And what that law states is that at the age, any person born to a slave mother will earn their freedom at the age of 25. So 1829 is actually the first year in which you can have, in which a slave would be emancipated under this law. And the idea there was that African Americans needed to be trained in democracy and in freedom, essentially, that these were not people who were well suited to freedom, and that they were going to have to learn how to do it. This gradual emancipation law has some other unintended consequences, in that if you're a New Jersey slave owner and you believe that this is your property and you're entitled to whatever you want to do with it, then prior to this gradual emancipation date, you might sell those slaves in order to get the money for them. And so many New Jersey slaves actually would suffer a much harsher fate in being sold into the Southwest, where we're talking graduations of bad, right? I mean, there's not a good slavery and a bad slavery. It's like a really, really bad slavery and just a really pretty bad slavery. But most scholars, I think, would agree that the conditions of slavery on a cotton plantation in the Southwest were harsher than they were in an urban area in New Jersey or on a farm in Hunterdon County, let's say, or in Bergen County even. So there's some unintended consequences with regard to that as well. Slavery in New Jersey is really tricky. It's even reversed here. Like I said, North Jersey has a higher slave population. South Jersey has a much smaller slave population. Basically, by the 1760s, the Quakers decide that you can be a good Quaker or you can be a slave owner, but you can't really be both. And so many Quakers free their slaves. Some sell their slaves, some free their slaves, some quit being a Quaker. But it leads to a much smaller enslaved presence in South Jersey than you have in North Jersey, for example. New Jersey has the legacy of being the only state which did not succeed, but which failed to give a majority of its vote to Lincoln in either the 1860 or 1864 election. It's important to remember that the attitudes towards gradual emancipation are shaped very much by the persistent racism that is here in New Jersey. One of the most powerful documents that I ever came across in our Liberty Hall archive was a document by Susan Vanbrugh Livingston Kane Nimsevich, who's actually the woman that brings the Livingston and Kane families together. The Kanes are all from New Jersey. We think of them as from New Jersey. They're actually from South Carolina and Georgia. The original Kane family money is in land and slaves in New Jersey, or South Carolina and in Georgia. And John Kane comes up here and marries a Livingston, and that's what brings them together. But it was a manumission document that Susan issued for two of her slaves in 1829. Freeing them under the condition that they remain in service to her. So basically it's like, I'll set you free as long as you keep doing the same job that you've been doing. And what's particularly powerful about it is that they sign it by making their mark. And so there's an X above each of their names, which wasn't uncommon at the time, but for me was just kind of particularly poignant. And New Jersey's challenges with regard to slavery will continue from the Revolutionary period all the way forward. Slavery is growing after the period of the American Revolution. The number of enslaved population grows at 20% from 1790 to 1800 in the northern counties. So again, African American freedom struggle requires much more than the words and even the actions of the Revolutionary era. Even the Reconstruction period in New Jersey is pretty complicated. New Jersey only passes the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery and then the 15th Amendment establishing the right to vote for black men. And it's the 15th Amendment that the word man is used, that gender is specified in the Constitution for the first time. But in each of those cases, the law is only passed after it's already been passed by 3/4 of the states and 2/3 of the legislature. So it's kind of an afterthought for New Jersey's participation in that. So the history of New Jersey in the period of the American Revolution and both the antecedents to it and the legacies of it diverges from neighboring states in important ways. New Jersey has a much greater presence of both regular and irregular armies on its soil. I think New Jersey, more than any other state, we can really see the American Revolution as a civil war. One of the essay questions that I'm fond of giving my students is essentially arguing that what we call the American Revolution is really a civil war. What we call a civil war is really much more of American Revolution. There's much more change that occurs because of the Civil War than because of the American Revolution. And it's much more a civil war of neighbors fighting against neighbors in the American Revolution. New Jersey has this divide, and that South Jersey, North Jersey divide persists in some ways more powerful than others. The continued social, economic, cultural pull of two port cities creates a very unique environment. And so while I think it's frustrating for historians because there's not a simple thesis or even a simple narrative that you can do to kind of tie those together, on the other hand, in a lot of ways, the trends and what you see happening in New Jersey is to a certain extent kind of a micro study of American history in general. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to take some questions.